So basically, because of our technical difficulty, I'm just going to leave it as the slide view here. First off, I thought I would start with the stages of growth for a coach, and basically wanted to talk a little bit about how I got involved with Paralympics. It really started at the San Antonio Sports Festival, which was many years ago, and what happened at that was I was one of the commissioners for track and field, and this family came, or this volunteer came up to us and said, there's this family and they're crying and they want to talk to you. Of course, my first instinct was, what's gone wrong? Somebody's gotten hurt. What have they fallen on? And when I finally got to the family, their son had lost a leg that summer in a boating accident. And they were so appreciative that we had actually a 100 meters for amputees at that event, that they saw that their son was going to be okay, that their son was going to be able to do a lot of different things. So that was my first exposure, which kind of is very altruistic for me in the fact that we were giving hope to this family. The second incident was when I was asked in 2008 to help with the Team USA in Beijing, and then I worked the Paralympic trials. So I walk into the hotel, and I'm seeing a guy sitting on the floor, and he was probably about 2 feet high. Bob had arthrogryposis, and his legs never attached to his hips, so they were just kind of, he was sitting on top of his legs, and all I could see was a trunk and a head. So I walk into the elevator, and I'm giving myself a little self-talk as I'm going up, going, if I'm so shallow that I don't think I can help in this event, then I need to check myself. And so that got me starting thinking about the stages of growth for a coach in Paralympics. Basically, the first thing is the fear of the unknown. You don't have that much exposure to people with physical disabilities. It's a large population, but it's not. And so what do you do? How do you coach them? You don't know anything about it, possibly. Second fear was saying something wrong. Well, I'm going to tell you that people with physical disabilities have a sense of humor, and they realize that you're going to make mistakes and you're going to say things. I always talk to David Brown, who's totally brown. I say, David, did you see that? And he'll say, yeah, Coach, I saw that. I saw that. And then the third is shock, because some disabilities you see and you go, oh my God, how does that person function? And when you look at a quad amputee, no arms, no legs, and how they eat, you get amazed. But it's still kind of shocking. You wonder, well, how does he cook? How does he put his clothes on? He shows up dressed all the time, so obviously he's figured out some way to do it. But it's just kind of shocking sometimes when you see the different types of disabilities. The next step is acceptance. And that acceptance can either be for the disability, oh, so what, he's missing a leg, that's no big deal. Or it becomes acceptance of the person. And sometimes it's both. My athletes are delightful, intelligent, phenomenal athletes. And that acceptance comes very easy when you're working with that group. Then the next stage is that there's what we call advocacy. So this becomes a group that you start advocating for. You start walking into a bathroom and you go, a chair can't fit in here. You walk into a hotel, and I can remember some of the older Hampton Inns where the door moved inside. I could hardly move in and around the bathroom, let alone somebody with a chair. So you start looking for things. You look for curb bumps, cutouts for wheelchairs to be able to move around. And when you're moving lots of equipment, you're definitely looking for those. So anyway, there's kind of these stages, and it can happen in a day, it can happen in weeks, it can happen it doesn't matter. But basically, people go through these stages of trying to figure it out. And once you go through them, it becomes much easier in your dealings. Also want to, this is not on a slide, but in 2010, the census, they did a census report, and they asked about disabilities in that census. And about 19% of people in the United States have a disability. Think about that. That's 1 in 5 Americans have a disability. Now, that census report didn't tell us about what type of disability it was. Was it diabetes? Was it Alzheimer's? Was it ADD? It didn't really go into that. But if you think of 1 in 5 having a disability, that's quite a few Americans. In fact, at that time, it was about 56 million people had a disability of some sort. So if you dig deeper in that census report, you'll see, for instance, in Houston, Texas. So Houston, Texas, there were 18,000 people with a disability. If we think about only 1% of those people being eligible for Paralympic sport, that's 1,800 people in one city that could be eligible to experience Paralympics. So what is Paralympics? Well, actually its name comes from being parallel to the Olympics. All the athletes will have a disability of some sort. There's a wide variety, and we're going to talk about that a little bit different in a minute. Sports have different disability criteria based on the function of the sport, so not all the sports are alike. And a few sports include athletes with intellectually impaired disability. So the biggest thing between traditional sport and Paralympics is really classification. And that's just a structure to give a structure for the competition so that like disabilities compete against each other. It's kind of like weight classes or age group competitions, etc. Its classification is done by a trained classifier, trained usually by the IPC or authorized by the IPC or the international federation that governs that sport. And there are basically two types of classification. One is a national classification, which gets you competitive within the U.S., and then there's an international classification. And that varies from sport to sport. So what are we looking at? First off, none of the sports are the same. Like in track and field, our intellectually impaired athletes are called 20s. And in swimming, I believe they're S7s. So they're all completely different variations. So if you do classification with one sport, you'll have to go back and do classification with another sport because they're so different. So the categories: limb deficiency, okay? That can be arms, legs, combinations. Leg length difference. Leg length difference is a significant difference. It's not just, you're off an inch. There's a percentage on that. Short stature or dwarfs. In some of the sports, we have 2 different sizes of dwarfs. Visual impairment. We'll cover that in a little bit more, but visual impairment, VI, in fact, visual impairment is one of the largest groups of disabilities in the United States when you look at all age groups. Impaired muscle power. This is mostly your cerebral palsy. It's going to be some of your wheelchair athletes will also be looked at for impaired muscle power. Impaired passive range of motion, so that you do not have a range of motion in a particular limb. A lot of times that's going to be like a brachial plexus, an arm injury, where during delivery a baby is pulled out by their arm, and what happens is it destroys the whole brachial plexus complex, and so then they do not have a range of motion with that arm. Hypertonia, ataxia, athetosis, those are different types of cerebral palsy. Then the intellectually impaired. Intellectually impaired, the IQ level is around 75, and they have to have some sort of social issue that goes with that. So coaching in Paralympics. Technical aspects are very much the same as a traditional athlete, but coaching Paralympics, I believe, makes you a better coach because you need a huge amount of creativity. You're trying to look at a situation and solve the problem that is not going to be the same for every athlete. So your creativity is huge. The biggest thing that you have to think about is you analyze what the athlete has that you can work with, as opposed to what they do not have. And I'll give you an example of that. We had a seated thrower. My background is track and field, so that's one of the huge components for us is what do they have that you can work with. We had a seated thrower. She was throwing the club, and I kept trying to get her to have a straight arm to throw. And she kept doing what I call the chicken wing. She'd tuck it in. Well, she didn't have a tricep. So she didn't have any other, muscles to actually work with. So by having the bicep, she was always going to chicken wing it because that's the only muscle that she could activate. So that's why it's important to really work with and figure out what they have that you can work with as opposed to what they don't have. One of the other things that we're seeing is the need for symmetry. If an athlete, we call them congenitals, if they acquired it at birth, or acquired if it happened later on in their life. But a congenital athlete who's missing a limb has been compensating for most of their life. So what we see is an overmuscularity of one side, to the point that in some athletes it can actually have the spine start curving toward that side, particularly for upper arm amputees or brachial plexus. And when that happens, then you start seeing an imbalance in the rest of the body. And anytime you have an imbalance, you're going to have an issue with injuries. So the imbalance on the upper body usually affects one of the hamstrings. And this athlete was having a huge amount of hamstrings problems. So that's the value of trying to work on symmetry, which we've been really working with him. And this is a life issue for him. And the sooner we can get those things addressed by parents and physical therapists and coaches, the less that these athletes are going to have to try to overcome later in life. Toby was much later. Coaching the different disabilities. First off, you have to figure out how the athlete is affected. And then is it acquired or from birth? Because you have two different things here. You have both a physical issue and an emotional issue. If it's congenital, most of my double leg amputees are congenitals, and they don't know anything different. So their gait is sometimes different, but they also are very used to not having legs, as opposed to some of my veterans who have lost a leg in battle. Now they're trying to figure out how this new life looks and this new reality to them, how they deal with it. Real Sport last night had a great segment on Amy Van Dyken and her new reality. And it has been very, very difficult for her. So you can see it's an emotional complex as well as a physical issue. So the next part is, what is their comfort level to try new activities? Well, I can tell you that a congenital kid is going to try anything they can, and they're not afraid of anything. Whereas an acquired athlete, sometimes there's a little like, well, I don't know if I can do that or not. So trying to get their comfort level up is huge. We like to try hopping on your prosthetic. We like wheelchair athletes to try to move, to turn, to try to do all sorts of different activities, trying to expand their comfort level to trying things. Do they have any mobility limitations? Well, some of them will. And we'll talk a little bit later about Harrington rods, but some of them do have a limitation, particularly in wheelchairs, due to the Harrington rods. Do they have past athletic experience? Lex Gillette in high school, and Lex is totally blind, and Lex is a long jumper. Now imagine running as fast as you can down a runway, taking off, and hoping that you land in a pit of sand. To me, that's very frightening. But Lex is a high school kid. His high school coach came out, and his buddies got him to come out for track and field. And his high school coach said, okay, in the long jump, what you do is you run down the runway, you don't look at the board, and you jump into the pit. And Lex goes immediately, I can do that. So the idea here is that if you have any past athletic experience, since he started jumping in high school, his athletic potential or his time in sport is very great compared to some of the ones that have not been in past experience. And then it's also, when did this occur? Because if you have some idea of what things look like, particularly for a blind athlete, then it's easier for you to have the concept of what we're trying to teach. Then, are they conceptually familiar with sports drills? Have they ever done a high knee? Have they ever done boundings or throwing balls or any of that other type of basic activity, any of the basic locomotor skills? I say that in one regard, but I can remember as a college coach, I had to teach athletes how to hop all the time because they didn't have that basic locomotor skill. So some of this is not that much different. So, visually impaired athlete. This is a real challenge. When you're trying to teach, you have to first figure out what's their dominant learning style. Most of them are going to be kinesthetic rather than visual or auditory. There's going to be some auditory. Teaching them, you can do it a variety of ways. You can try to put their body in the position that you're looking for. Let's imagine that you're teaching a discus throw. Okay? This is pretty technical. So how do I do that? Well, first thing is I might put their feet in the position that I want them in. Or the other way is to have them feel my foot where it's placed, then have them feel where my knee is and where my hips are. Then as I turn my foot, they can feel the pivot of the foot. Then I do the same thing, and I have them feel my knee, and they feel the pivot in my knee. And the second one, or the third one, is to feel my hip, to feel the pivot of the hip. So there's a variety of ways, and that's where it becomes, like I said, being creative with your teaching. With a VI athlete, you have to be very clear and very concise of what you're trying to teach them. It's just very short, simple, and then have them perform the task. Intellectually impaired. Track and field, rowing, swimming. I think there are 4 sports now that have intellectually impaired athletes. And there's a difference in intellectually impaired athletes and those from Paralympics to Special Olympics. Paralympics is not a hug for everybody. These athletes are extremely, extremely competitive. In fact, the 1500 for the Paralympic Games in 2016 was faster than the Olympic winner. And the young man happens to be an American that led the way, and his name is Michael Brannigan. He is a sub-4-minute miler, and runs like 3:38 in the 1500. That is not the quality of Special Olympics. And if he would have been stuck in the Special Olympic system, he would have not matured to the level that he needed to mature. Now, they may need some assistance, and so typically we have what we call a personal care attendant, or a PCA, and I usually have one PCA for any of the athletes that are intellectually impaired. Not that they need to be told about making sure they take a shower, making sure that they eat. No, they need to know what time they're going to meet somebody, where they're going to meet them, and what they need to do, and what they need to have. So it's basic just assistance, particularly in places where they've never been, the language is different, they don't understand much of anything. Some of them do not like to be touched. With Mikey, after he wins a race, my thing is, I like to rub his head, probably a safe sport violation there, but always ask permission. Can I rub your head? And he goes, yeah, because I always like to mess up his hair. The other part of it is that you have to have a lot of patience. Patience, patience, patience. And you have to always remember that they may not understand exactly what you're trying to tell them. But this group has the most sincere emotions of any group I've ever worked with. When he crossed the line at Rio, he put his hands up in the air and he goes, I did it! I did it! Very pure emotion. When Brianna Clark set a world record at the World Championships in London, she started dancing. She was happy. I mean, just basic, pure, raw emotion. And so they're a very fun group to work with. Coaching athletes with cerebral palsy, this also is traumatic brain injuries and sometimes childhood strokes. Some children, when they're at birth, they're under so much trauma that they actually have a stroke. And so they relate very much so to the cerebral palsy group. Also, the children with the shaken baby syndrome will also come with this group. We have a wide variety of athletes fitting these categories. Now, again, every sport is different, so this is a different type of classification, but just wanted to cover this group because they have such a wide variety and such different needs. One or more limbs usually affected. Then there's ataxia, which is a motor coordination. So this is the same as a CP, but it really is a cerebellum issue. And what happens is that a lot of times these athletes are also deaf. So the ataxia with motor coordination, there is some deafness that does occur sometimes. Temperature, huge factor with them. The spasticity tends to increase when it's cold. Warm weather, there's a little less spasticity. So if it's a cold environment, you have to really watch or just try to keep them as warm as possible. Fatigue will also increase their spasticity. So with classification, this is a factor. Many times they may go in and the classifier may not see the true effect of their cerebral palsy, so sometimes you'll want them to do a little workout prior to going into classification so it really manifests and shows their cerebral palsy. Balance is an issue. We call it the Igor walk. For some of them that are in the 4-limb affected group, they may compete in a chair because of this balance issue, but they can walk as long as it's slow, but they cannot walk for long distances. However, they can be trained to do that. It takes a lot of patience and encouragement and desire on the athlete's part to learn to do that. There is what we call a startle reflex. So anytime a gun goes off, and you can imagine this if you're coaching a swimmer, the gun goes off, they jump, and then they start. So it's just a reflex. And you'll see little kids they'll actually cover their ears or put their hands over their ears because the startle reflex is a major effect for them. And we know that all athletes get nervous. But athletes with cerebral palsy tend to have a higher rate of nervousness. It's just how they have to react in the neuromuscular coordination, etc. So it's just a nervousness, and you have to try to get them to get into a routine, as we try with all athletes, to have a competitive routine, a pre-competition routine, so that they can kind of calm down and relax so that they can have the performance that they're looking for. Next group is amputees, and I love this photo of this alpine skier because you can just see the strength that it takes, the coordination that it takes, and how on the thin edge this athlete really is. There are many types of amputees. They come in all sorts of shapes, forms, size. It can be they're missing a hand, if they're swimming or cycling, below the elbow, above the elbow, at the shoulder, at the hip, above the knee, any type of amputation in any location. Training for an amputee is basically like a traditional athlete. The modifications for this group really come to play in the strength and conditioning area. You'll see a lot of times they'll do their leg amputees. They can do their lifts. They just wear their day leg and they do all their lifts, cleans, jerks, everything, squats. But an arm amputee has a different issue. So we have to look at different ways to try to increase their strength levels. Vest, a belt with the chain, a belt around the waist, a strength belt around the waist with a chain up on two higher blocks so that they can do their squats. So you just become more creative with what you can do with those athletes. And sometimes the CP athletes will have the same issue because they may not be able to use one of their limbs. So then we're finding cable machines are very useful. And then there are different types of grip assistance that you can use. You can always use the tie-on straps, but there's also some gloves, they call them quad gloves, that you can use so that you can hold a bar. And those become useful to assist you in strength. But cable machines with a Velcro wrist strap and a D-ring work very effective for the CP kids and also for the arm amputees. This class is technology-driven. You're looking at the equipment that the alpine skier is using. You can see the technology in that. You can almost see a little bumper in the on the ski itself. For track and field, it's huge. They're always dinking around with their legs. They always want to change their blades before major competition. It absolutely drives me nuts. But the blade, they're not all made the same. They cut them out of sheets of fiberglass, and it depends upon the compression, what end or part of the sheet of fiberglass that they're cutting them out of, or the composite material. We're looking at all sorts of different composite materials. And the prosthetist, and you have to say that very carefully, the prosthetist is one of the keys to all of this. It's the setup of the leg. If the setup is too far in front, then the athlete is always braking on the prosthetic side. If it's too far behind them, they're not getting the push that we want. So it's very key is the precision of how the prosthetist sets the leg up. And so that becomes kind of an interesting quandary when you go through that. And if the athlete is above the knee, balance is always going to be an issue. And so one of the things that they need to learn very early on is learning how to roll, learning how to fall, because they will fall at some point, and they know it. And they're going to try things, so if you try something new, you might try it on the grass rather than the track surface or someplace where it's going to be easier for them if they fall. It's part of the knee mechanism. Sometimes it may not work smoothly, or they can't feel the bottom part of their leg and they can't feel the knee, so sometimes it gets put in an awkward position. And one of the other things with this class is we try to eliminate the swing. They have a tendency to swing their leg to the outside because that's what the physical therapists are teaching them. As they swing to the outside, it allows them to lift their foot up to put it down in front of them. Well, that's not a very sound biomechanical mechanism for running, where we're trying to teach them to lift. And we do a lot of extra work on step-ups in the gym, using boxes to put their prosthetic side on the top of the box and lift, because one of the things that they stop using as frequently is their hip flexor. So we want to try to use the hip flexor because they circumduct so much that the hip flexor gets ignored. So we want to try to develop it if that athlete has it. So next, I picked this picture for one reason, her shoulders. This is Tatiana McFadden, the dominant woman in wheelchair sport. She was a winter medalist. She's also a track and field athlete, probably the best endurance athlete in the world, bar none. She has swept all the major marathons 5 times in a row. Last year she experienced issues with blood clots. So in fact, her blood clots had been there. It's a hereditary condition. Her blood clots had been there for so long that her body had developed a whole capillary set around those. But it was getting to the point where she was starting to, she couldn't develop anymore, and she started having some swelling in that leg, and so they've worked very hard to try to help her with that. Strength training for this group is key, because if you think that all of your daily living is dealing with your shoulders, you've got to have very strong, flexible shoulder girdle and shoulder strength. Some of the workouts that they do, she goes to the University of Illinois, and the coach there, Adam Bleakney, I think is one of the best coaches in the world. Adam will actually, they have a strap hanging down from the ceiling. They put their legs in the strap. They have a set of stairs, and the beginning workout is walking up and down the stairs with your hands. As you progress, he puts weights on your back. Sounds archaic, but it seems to work.
No, it's just sounding very painful to me, okay? Yeah.
And they work up and down the stairs, and that go up and down to help that shoulder girdle. Maintenance programs for shoulders and for forearms is a huge part, not just for athletic ability, but for life ability. Athletes in a wheelchair drive cars, and to get to their car and get in, they pull up to their car, they open the car door, they take the wheels off, they scoot over, transfer into the car seat, they take the wheels off their chair, okay, because they're little quick release wheels. They take them, put them in the front seat, then they grab the frame and they turn and put it into their vehicle. That takes a lot of strength, and it takes a lot of flexibility. So just for their life issues, these things are very important. One of the things that we notice with wheelchair athletes is they have a tendency to be very concave. Their arms, because they're in a position where they're always using forward motion, that we try to get balance in that by doing a lot of reverse flies, trying to open up the chest a little bit more, because this position, it can be a chronic position. Harrington rods, I mentioned those earlier. When an athlete is in their teenage years, sometimes the physicians, they're worried about their posture and the ability of organs to function properly. And you talked about painful. This is, you know, Sam, this is really painful. So Harrington rods,
I think I know where you're going.
They take surgically steel rods and they insert them on either side of their spinal cord. And they attach it so that that athlete is perfectly vertical. They will have the best posture of anybody that you will know. And that's because of the Harrington rods. The rods are great. We're probably one of the few countries in the world that does this procedure, but it limits their mobility. They can no longer turn. So they cannot, they can't turn their shoulders. If they do, it's one solid movement with everything, and if you threw them a ball to the side, they would fall. So it's one of those things, and then later in life, sometimes they will outgrow the Harrington rods, and that becomes an issue, so they have to go back in and repair it. And then there's something I'd never, ever heard of before in my whole life, which was called a spinal tether. And sometimes the scar tissue from any surgery on the back will cause what they call tethering, which is the scar tissue will actually pull to one side. And as it pulls, it disrupts the spinal cord function. So if you have an athlete that's had surgery and all of a sudden starts having issues with motor control, you might need to encourage them to go back in to look for this tethering. We had an athlete that had that issue. They went through and they removed the tethers. And she said it was like having an old-fashioned phone cord untwist. And that's how she felt. And she got immediate relief and got her hand function back. Safety. We are required to always wear helmets. Wheelchair races are notorious for crashes. They will occur, and that's why we wear helmets. And we wear helmets in warm-up, and in fact, I think most athletes in a wheelchair race, and this happens to be a racing chair that she's in, will wear a helmet. Technology, again, you probably read about the BMW project where BMW was building us a racing chair. They did a great job at it, but it was a little heavy. But it was a phenomenal chair, and they were looking at things that needed to be done so that the sport could progress, but also so there might be other... You look at sport, and sport sometimes changes the way daily life functions. So anything that we could find out of the wheelchair racing section could help those in their day chairs. Coaching team sports. I just put a couple of little segments in here. You look at the flexibility of the athlete reaching for the basketball, and pretty impressive. And then the sit volleyball athletes, a lot of them are amputees, but not necessarily. But every sport, or most sports, may have a different point system, requiring different levels of disability on the floor at a time. So, for instance, a quad athlete may be a 5, where a para athlete may be a 1, or it might be the opposite of that, and you can only have so many points on the floor at a time. So it becomes very tricky. So sports are looking for both a quad, and a quad is just somebody that's affected in their 4 limbs, or a lot of these we think of quadriplegic and paraplegic as totally non-functioning, but sometimes these athletes are incomplete, and that's kind of a different a different distinction, that they're not totally complete. And some of them are what we call neurological quads, that they have no issue with the spinal cord, but neurologically they have the same lack of function. And then a para is usually half, so it may be just one section of their body, their lower half or their upper half. Typically it's the lower half. I've never met somebody that's been an upper half, but the lower half is affected. And some of it's different levels even at that. So some have, when we look at the wheelchair athletes again, some have use of their abdominals, some do not. Some have full use of their hands, some do not. So that all makes a difference in how they're able to train and how they're competing. So, challenges in Paralympics. Moving equipment. I'm sitting here with a guy at fencing that has to move not only wheelchairs, but fencing chairs and fencing platforms. And it's a lot of equipment to get moved. Swimming has it pretty easy. They just move a swimsuit, Maybe, well, they actually have wheelchair athletes, but it's the movement of equipment that becomes a real challenge when you start having racing chairs, day chairs, throwing frames, just all the different equipment that goes along. In fact, I laugh, in London we filled a 7-ton truck just with equipment. Other challenges. It may not be known, but IPC has a limit to the number of people that can participate in the games. This was part of an arrangement they did when the Paralympics followed the Olympics. The Olympics said, we're on with that, but the local organizing committees, we don't want them, we need to control how many athletes go into the village. So we take about half, actually it's less than that. I want to say the number's like 1,200. Don't quote me on that, but it's a significant less number of athletes in the Paralympic Games than there are in the Olympic Games. And in some sports, then they even limit that to the number of athletes that you can take because they don't want to go over that overall limit. So for instance, in track and field, the largest number I could ever take to any competition is 80. And that's the overall limit. Now, we have to earn those slots, and we've never earned 80. China's the only country that has. But the concept is that we're trying to control the numbers of athletes in the village, so we limit each team to a certain number. And that's, we call them slots. And so that becomes an issue, trying, A, to earn the number of slots, and B, your limitation. Now, traditional sport does not have that limitation, but we do because of the number of classifications that we have. So we're limited to the number of athletes. A traditional track and field team would take about 110 athletes, whereas the most we can take is 80. Pipeline development. Woo, this is a big one. It's a challenge activity trying to find athletes in a HEPA era with athletes that may not want to be identified. Some parents don't want their child to be looked at as disabled. And we particularly see this in the cerebral palsy area. They want their child to have as normal of a life as they can. And we get it. But the thing is, as we all know, sports makes them more able to be able to function and to do things. And that's one of the keys. They can do all sorts of activities in sports. And we find a lot of kids embedded in the traditional sports world. In fact, I have 4 collegiate athletes that are embedded, that we found, who were embedded in their collegiate system. So most of them are arm amputees, and one was visually impaired. So trying to find people is the hardest task that we have, I think, for any of the Paralympic sports, is finding athletes or identifying children who would like to become athletes and then getting them involved in programs. Our network for programming is different. We have some Paralympic sport clubs. We have about 180 of them scattered throughout the U.S. They don't offer every sport. They're just local clubs, and they're doing funding and trying to have Paralympic sports and introducing children to those and finding kids and getting them involved. Many of the sports are using the traditional pipeline. Swimming is almost all in regular swim clubs. We're seeing that trend now in track and field. Wheelchair basketball is a little different. There happens to be leagues. It's a huge collegiate sport, wheelchair basketball. In fact, the University of Alabama just built a $4 million facility for wheelchair sport. So it's going in my mind, it's going in the right direction when we think about the number of kids that can be impacted by just having the ability to be in sport. Schools, coaches, officials. So schools, we have been working diligently with a lot of the state high school associations to include wheelchair sport in their state high school meets. Three sports are very easy to modify or to bring into high school sports without any modification of facilities. That's track and field, swimming, and tennis. So we're really working to try to get those sports into the school programs, and those kids, all the benefits that we talk about being in sport for traditional athletes holds true for kids with physical disabilities. It's the same, you get the determination, dedication, discipline, commitment, all of those things, teamwork that we feel are important for traditional sport. It helps the kids with physical disability the same, if not more. So one of our big pushes is trying to include that. Now, the state of California went past, just said, nope, we're going to do it for all of them. So they actually have a wheelchair category, and they have an ambulatory category so that kids with CP can progress up, or arm amputees or amputees of any sort. They can earn a spot and compete at the state meet with kids just like them. It's been fairly successful. We have 24 states that currently are doing at least wheelchair. Texas is supposed to be adding the para, and one of the things with this is that we have developed a kind of a little flyer explaining, it's called Best Practices for Inclusion, and we talk about how it is, how you do it. And it's a very, very simple process. People who help us with the pipeline besides schools are also coaches, other coaches, traditional coaches. So we want to make sure that everybody knows what we're looking for, because you may have one in your school, you may see one in your district or your state or in a college. So a lot of our coaches help us find other athletes. And then the one area is officials. Officials probably see more track meets or more swim meets, more volleyball matches, basketball games, anything than any one group. So educating officials on Paralympics is a huge area because, in fact, I found 3 athletes from one official. He said, there's this girl here, or there's another girl here, and so we were able to locate 3 athletes that came into the system and actually did very well just because an official happened to see this athlete and go, put 2 and 2 together. Coaches. The hardest next part is coaches, trying to find coaches. High performance, this is a little turn here. We're going to talk a little bit. This is where Sam said I could talk about some other things.
Absolutely.
High performance questions. First question is, will it help athletes? Second question, where can you focus your resources to improve your medal count? What can you do to do that? Third is to reach out and embrace the whole community. Use all your resources. You cannot think you are the only person that holds the key to everything. The more people that have the key, the more doors get open, the more opportunities people have, and the bigger your pipeline becomes. Personally, I think training design is one of the key issues. Learning how to plan is the key to performance. You screw up some of the planning toward the very end, and your performances are going to suffer. And then next is you and the athlete both need to know what it takes to win now and what the trends are going to be. And have them work at their goals and try to work toward whatever it's going to take to win in the future. So the formula to me is very simple for high performance. It's having the right athletes with the right coaches in the right competitions. Because if you don't get the competitiveness that you need, you're not going to improve. And this is a bunch of rights. In the right place and the right time to have conversations with athletes. And there's kind of a little graph over on the side, and I think you can probably figure that out. But sometimes when an athlete has a really poor performance, talking to them immediately is not the right time. So you have to find the right time and the right place to have that conversation. And it's not doing it in front of all of his teammates or her teammates. One of the things is athletes first, winning second. That is an old Rainer Martin, way back when statement, and it holds true today as it did then. If you take care of your athletes are going to take care of you. And if you just worry about taking care of them, they'll get the winning done. I used to worry and count medals because, as we all know in the Olympic world, if you don't get your medal count, you don't get your funding. And I used to worry about that. And it drove me nuts. It was very stressful for me. So finally what I did is I just said, screw it. I'm just going to take care. Make sure that they've got everything they need when they need it, and we'll just see what happens. I was much happier, and the medal count improved. You need to reduce stress at any major competition. The athlete has enough stress as it is. Any stress that you can remove is great. You don't need to scream at them. You don't need to yell at them. You just need to say, what do you need? Can I help you? Why are you doing that? You know, just very simple things, but remove all that stress. And your staff has to understand that's the atmosphere that you want at the competition, is you want it to be a lot of fun, because it should be, and you want to remove all that stress from the athlete. And if you're going to have an issue, you guys take it someplace else and discuss it, but you come out. You don't want to have an athlete be in the middle of a battle at a major competition. And you need to have mutual respect with your athletes and your competition staff. That mutual respect is a huge part of athletics. And I think sometimes, particularly in the world of safe sport now, we're forgetting that mutual respect. And that you don't have to scream and yell, and you don't have to be a bully to get what you need done. And I always think of, would I want what I want to say said to me if that was my employer? Would I want my employer saying those things to me? No, don't say them to your athletes. And then Coach's Ed, just a few things. We need to design Coach's Ed from the top down. What do we really want our elite level coaches to know? And then start breaking it down into smaller pieces. And I think that would be, it sounds simple, but that is a way, I think we've always done it you design it from the top down, you build it from the bottom up. What do coaches really need to know in your sport? What's really important? And what information can you give them that will impact the sport the most? Then KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. I think it's extremely important that you try to be clear, concise, make it easy to understand, easy to read. Sometimes I read articles and it's so full of jargon that I get distracted trying to figure out what they're talking about. When if they weren't trying to impress me with their knowledge and just keep it simple, it'd be a lot easier. And then feedback theory. I know that you're going to have some on that maybe later on. That when they're younger, they need more feedback more frequently as they're trying to learn a skill. As an elite level athlete, it's less feedback. You need to make them think about what they're doing. Because one of the things that happens at the games is a coach may be a long way away from the athlete, and the athlete has to know how to handle that. And if you've been giving them the answers all the time, they can't do that. And my last piece here is, and I love this, it's an organization, it's called Train Ugly. You know, embrace the challenge, embrace the ugly, because we know at times when they get trained that you're going, oh my God, what is that? But that's part of the learning process, so we have to embrace the ugly. Thank you.
John Kessel turned me on to Train Ugly because I think the Train Ugly is a volleyball coach somewhere, or he uses a lot of volleyball examples. And yeah, John, not surprisingly, John turned me on to that one.
Yep.
All right, folks, if you want to pop in a question on the chat feature there, that would be great. Click on that real quick and let's see what somebody had sent one in earlier. Okay. Oh, that was from me. Okay. My own message went through there. So, Cathy, while I give folks a chance, let's talk a little bit about, you have a long background in coaching education. You were, and by the way, Cathy just retired last week from the USOC. You know, maybe talk about what you've seen in terms of educating coaches in your time, both as a coach and what you received, and then you were in that position to try to educate coaches. And what you're seeing right now might be on a big global or on a big national scale. We'll stick with just the U.S.
Yep. So I first started with USA Track and Field, and actually I took their first coaches education programs for both their level 1 and level 2. And I felt that the reason why I'm passionate about training design is it changed my life as a coach. When I learned how to properly put together, or even just think about the order in which we're training and how we're doing things, and then people like later on when I was at the USOC and could spend money to bring in the people that I thought were important, like a gentleman by the name of Inigo Mojica, who is a phenomenal researcher and person regarding peaking and tapering.
And coach as well. That's the other part that separates him from other people is he coaches triathletes and swimmers. He's not just an ivory tower guy. He practices what he preaches. And
his material, I think, is very important, particularly when we're talking about performance at games. Learning how to peak and taper is huge. I am a little concerned about the coaching realm right now in light of safe sport and bullying as a part of safe sport, and just the direction that we're going to tend to go in that. It's a pendulum. I hope it doesn't swing too far to where it gets very, it's serious now, but I hope it doesn't continue to grow and grow and grow on the negative side. I hope that at some point we see some sort of balance that comes together.
No, it's for you. Okay, no.
So that we can see, so that coaches can coach. I think about the times when an athlete has crossed a line of behavior, and that I have verbally talked to them. Reprimanded is a good word. Chastise, all good words.
Well.
In front of a group. Well, I did that because I needed to make a point that that athlete had crossed that line. But today, I might not be able to do that because of the quote bullying part of this. So I'm a little concerned about that, because there's it's not that you're trying to bully, you're trying to correct, and you want the other athletes to understand that you will not tolerate this behavior. So I'm not sure how we can go about doing that. Other than that, we're seeing lots. I always wanted the NGB to be the source of coaches' education, because I felt that an NGB would embrace lots of different thoughts and different issues and come together as a consensus builder. And always thought that that was important at the NGB. instead of some individual putting that online and, you know, then becoming the guru part of, why didn't you be doing it? You kind of eliminate the gurus.
I'm always afraid of those gurus. Even the words kind of scares me, as a real negative connotation. Yep. Hey, got a question here for you, and this is more on the coaching education. So Linda asks, what is the coaching skill you wish more coaches were better at? And then I'll come back to the second part.
Well, I've kind of hit on it once. That would be the training, design, planning, and preparing. The next one would be the communication part. I think learning different communication skills, being able to relate to the athlete, even though we know millennials are different, they're not that much different than everybody else, particularly on the athletic field. So I think communication and training design, the technical aspects, safety, if that is a technical aspect and it's safety related, that's huge as well.
And how have you developed the coaches you work with to develop or enhance that skill?
We try to do, well, we break ours up. In Paralympics, our funding is very limited. So what I do is I do summits, and we invite all of our top coaches in, and we'll do, like we have one planned in May, it's for wheelchair coaches. And so we'll have them all come in, and we're going to talk about training of wheelchair athletes. We've done one in the past. We talked about strength and conditioning, shoulder maintenance, flexibility exercises. We brought more of the PT, shoulder maintenance issues, strength training, making hard gloves. This time, Adam's going to try to focus more on the coaching, tactics, strategies, coaching skills, and we're going to talk about each of the different classes and different techniques coaches are using to do that. Most of my coaches, if they're in our system, if their athlete is a national team member, I pay the coach, and the coach is required to submit a training program in order to receive payment. So I get to review those, and sometimes I'll call a coach and say, tell me about this. What is this drill you keep using over and over again? I don't know what this drill is, so can you tell me about it? Or sometimes I see one that I question if they're getting enough volume. And then I look to my resources of some of our better coaches and talk to them about, you know, is this adequate for this athlete? So then we have to have another conversation. I'm very fortunate. I consider some of the top coaches in track and field working with us. So I feel very good about that.
Very cool. Very good. All right. Well, we've run a little bit long here. I appreciate folks bearing with the technical difficulties at the start, and also hoping that folks found this helpful to them in terms of Paralympics. I made 2 pages worth of notes that I was making here on stuff that I want to keep that I want to keep my brain wrapped around. And Cathy, I want to thank you for time and putting this together. And I think, you know, too often, and I'll admit to being guilty of this. Sometimes the wheelchair, the para sport it's an afterthought, and trying to make it a little bit more mainstream in our sport as well. We run into a lot of the issues. Fencing, first of all, is a very small sport to begin with. Talk about wheelchair fencing, even smaller, and the equipment. Clubs, it's a very expensive thing, so if a person rolls in, that club probably doesn't have all the equipment necessary, which makes it really, that's a big barrier. Plus, some of our clubs, quite honestly, the physical barriers are getting in. There's quite a few that are, you know, in very old buildings where you have to go upstairs. There's no elevator because it's grandfathered in before ADA and stuff. So there are those things that are, I don't think about them on a daily basis until I realize, oh, how is he going to get up there to fence at that second floor?
I wanted to
go ahead.
One other statement. Like, this year is the wheelchair summit. Next year will be the throws group. Okay. The following year will be the sprints and jumps. Okay. And so we just separate them out by individual groups, so it's smaller, and I can bring in more coaches. Yeah,
makes perfect sense. All right. Okay. Well, thanks, and again, thanks everybody for joining us. if you're available at 8 a.m. Mountain Time tomorrow, I'll have Stephen Soller on to talk about the Norwegian sports culture. If those of you who are listening to this recording, that will be posted as soon as I can get it posted on YouTube and the USCC website. So thanks again, everybody. I appreciate you joining us.